I confronted my former boss about unpaid equipment. He refused. I then wiped my tech remotely, costing him thousands in lost revenue. I hope this does not backfire, but I am confident that I have not violated any laws, so here it is. I apologize for the lengthy post. Let me provide some context. Since I was a child, I have been intrigued by computers and electronics. Throughout my schooling, I lacked a social life. I simply stayed at home and absorbed knowledge. I attended a general high school intended to prepare students for university without any specific focus, but there were a few classmates who shared my interests, and our information technology teacher was incredibly encouraging. By the time I completed high school, I had already secured a job as a programmer and gained a few years of experience in the industry. Additionally, I was knowledgeable in electronics and had even completed several contracts for a local factory, which involved designing machines for them. Other engineers would devise concepts for how the machines would operate, while my role entailed integrating motors and sensors, wiring everything, and writing programs for the programmable logic controllers to manage the systems. I relocated to a large city and began attending university, which meant I had to give up my programming position back home. I set out to find a part-time job while relying on my parents for financial support. Everything shifted when a friend received an escape room voucher for 5 individuals as a birthday gift and invited me to join him. The escape game featured fascinating, magical elements, such as placing objects on a shelf that caused pictures to fall off the walls, among other surprises. Although we were engaged in puzzle solving, I was more captivated by these magical effects, formulating theories about their construction, and pondering how I would execute similar tricks. After the game finished, I caught a glimpse of their technical room, and at that moment I thought, I want to work here. I submitted my resume, and since I was overqualified for the position, I was accepted following the first interview. Being young, naive, and inexperienced, they exploited me. My hourly wage, after taxes, was equivalent to $8.50. For comparison, a cashier at a major store in the area earns around $6.50 plus benefits. The first few months were fantastic. I was getting paid to pursue my hobby, and the owner appreciated my efforts as his previous technician, now referred to as tech moron, was considered quite incompetent in comparison. I am not boasting, I assure you. He rarely generated any original designs, instead sourcing ideas from the internet and possessing just enough skill to interpret schematics and replicate them. However, he had significant gaps in his knowledge. Once he claimed that it was impossible to build a battery-operated circuit that could function while charging, stating that this would cause the battery to explode. When I informed him about charging regulators and how such a scenario was not a concern with devices like phones or laptops, he simply told me that I was hired to assist him and to leave him alone. Over time, Tech Moron began to recognize that I was smarter than he was, and his ego could not tolerate it, prompting him to make my work life miserable. For instance, the owner assigned me the task of replicating a device already present in one game for use in another. I spent a week pestering Tech Moron for the schematics and source code, sending him messages and calling him without receiving any response. Finally, I decided to abandon him and devised an improved design that I built independently. When I presented it at the following meeting to the owner, who was very pleased with the result, Tech Moron yelled at me for not using his design and wasting time reinventing the wheel. Eventually, the owner became aware of the situation and hired another technician, referred to as Tech Senior from this point, but he could not dismiss Tech Moron since he retained all the essential source codes and designs on his laptop. Due to a poor contract, these were not owned by the escape room company. Little did we know that in the future, he would refuse to hand over most of the designs and codes, forcing us to rewrite everything from scratch. The company was also involved in franchising. We duplicated a running game and installed an exact copy at a new location. We then offered support while the franchisees paid us licensing fees, which were typically a small percentage of their profits. The owner was a typical manager, believing that 9 women could deliver a baby in a month, a mentality that became evident as the company expanded. Eventually, Tech Senior was promoted to my supervisor due to his greater expertise in electronics, while my focus was more on programming and on site support for game masters whenever something malfunctioned. We largely ignored Tech Moron by this point, as he would appear only once a month, contribute nearly nothing, criticize all of our completed work, and then leave. Business was thriving, so we hired several electronics students to assist us. The props department, responsible for creating items such as special tables where we could hide our magic, also grew. Everything was on the upswing until a meeting regarding a new franchise client took place. The owner outlined the client's requirements. We, the tech team, conferred with the props department, reviewed all the necessities, and informed him that we needed 10 weeks to complete the project. Well, 8, but we always anticipated possible delays, as this would be reflected in the contract. The usual processes in a healthy company. During the following week's meeting, the owner announced that the client refused to wait and had set a 5-week deadline in the contract. His justification was that we were merely repeating previous work, and now that we had more personnel, it would be expedited. We worked tirelessly, I mean truly hard. There were weeks when I would only go home for 8 hours to shower and sleep briefly before returning to the workshop to work on projects. It was challenging, yet we managed to complete everything on time, and I earned a nice sum from the overtime. However, this ultimately proved to be a mistake. Now we had demonstrated that what he wanted was achievable. Consequently, subsequent contracts imposed the same unrealistic deadlines. More overtime ensued. I recall having almost no social life, dedicating entire weeks to work, occasionally sleeping at the workshop while feeling extremely stressed. Every Friday, I would go to a pub with a few friends, drink heavily to relieve the tension, and sleep through the entire weekend. Then Monday would arrive, and the cycle would begin again. Eventually, I transitioned from, "I love this job," to, "I don't care anymore," and I was not alone in this sentiment. Our productivity declined and we began to miss deadlines. Did the owner take this into account in the contracts? Absolutely not. Repetition leads to perfection. This time you can complete it more quickly, was his rationale. He continued to sign contract after contract, piling work onto us. I vividly remember one meeting when he inquired about the status of Project D, as the deadline loomed the following week. We had not even started on this project, as we were already overwhelmed with Project C, which had commenced later because we had not completed projects and B on time. This illustrates how dire the situation had become. Funds from new contracts were being used to pay fines from old contracts. At this moment, I realized enough was enough. Naturally, our responsibilities extended beyond franchising. We operated our own games that needed continuous maintenance, and we constantly juggled this alongside the challenges of franchising. The primary issue with all the games was the control software. It comprised a myriad of simplistic scripts driving all the Raspberry Pis and Arduinos in the game, ideally showcasing a unified user interface for the game master to oversee all props, override functions, etc., at least in theory. However, it was riddled with bugs. Sometimes it wouldn't function at all. On other occasions, when trying to highlight an object to provide a clue for players, it would instead open doors to subsequent levels and so on. It lacked universality, and even simple requests necessitated significant alterations, with many overrides incorrectly implemented. One day, the owner finally conceded to my requests and granted me permission to rewrite everything. It took me several months, but I developed a universal engine capable of accommodating all the demands placed on us by game designers, which was also straightforward to expand. It included error protection and recovery features. Now, if a prop ceased responding, one could simply access a debug page and click Restart. This was revolutionary, as in the past, game masters had to cut power, and sometimes this was not feasible during gameplay. And my crowning achievement was creating an easy-to-use scripting language to outline game workflows. The game masters were now equipped with a plethora of functional controls and the ability to interrupt predefined tasks and alter the flow. However, this rarely occurred, as the game had become nearly automatic, with their role mainly being to offer hints. I felt uncomfortable running this software on a Raspberry Pi designed for earlier control tasks, and I sought superior hardware. The owner consistently denied my requests, but the game's manager was eager to have the new software operational as soon as possible. Up to that point, we had only been testing it from my laptop. Thus, I decided to lend them a few PCs. A while back, a friend from a large corporation had salvaged several Dell Optiplex workstations from e-waste. They were in good condition, featured Intel i5 CPUs, 8 GB of RAM, capable onboard graphics, DisplayPort, USB 3.0, and were fully functional, typically costing about $200 refurbished. The company had no use for them, and no one wanted to deal with their sale, leading to their disposal. I had a stack of 20 of these computers at home, gathering dust. I brought a few of them to work, and my boss agreed to sort it out later, so I emailed him a list of all the hardware I had provided for the games, 5 PCs, some Wi-Fi routers, old tables, a few monitors, and other items I had primarily salvaged from e-waste, repaired, and had no use for. Naturally, I did not mention that I had acquired these items for free and anticipated payment for them. Fast forward, I was frustrated with the relentless franchise deadlines and received several job offers that made me aware of my actual value, realizing I was being exploited as a young individual in my 20s, working for almost nothing. However, I decided to wait. Within the next month, my software was implemented in the remaining games. Tech Moron had been absent for a few months, and Tech Senior possessed some programming skills that allowed him to utilize my scripting language, but he had limited understanding of the intricacies of the complex engine I had developed, which had taken over a year to create. I had achieved results, I was now valuable, and I had demands. I scheduled a meeting with the owner to present a list of grievances and my proposed solutions. This culminated in a singular argument. I was unhappy, but my expertise was crucial for them, so they would rectify these issues and grant me a raise, or I would leave. I intended to remain firm in my position. A recruiter from a significant information technology company had contacted me on LinkedIn a few weeks earlier, and I had already attended an interview, providing me with a potential escape route. The future appeared promising, and I was prepared to pursue it. The meeting day arrived, and I felt optimistic until an unfortunate incident occurred in the workshop. I would prefer not to provide details, as they might identify me immediately, but this event was significant. As the youngest employee, despite not being responsible for the mess, I was assigned the task of cleaning it up. I argued with the workshop manager, insisting that I was a programmer and not a hazardous waste cleanup worker, but ultimately I broke down and began cleaning. Halfway through, nearly gagging from the stench, I snapped. None of this would transpire in a respectable IT company. I returned to my office, gathered my belongings, and logged onto my computer, playing games while waiting for the owner. When he arrived, I addressed all the issues, and while he contested some points when we reached the conclusion, I informed him that this was the final straw, and that I was leaving immediately. As I was employed as an independent contractor to save them money on taxes, my agreement contained no stipulations about my tenure. I told him I would send him a download link for all my files, since the contract specified the company owned them. He pleaded for me to remain for one more month as they were falling behind on numerous deadlines. I told him I would consider it and departed. On my way home, I contacted the recruiter to accept the job offer and I could start the following month. The next day, I compiled a large archive of approximately 150 gigabytes of files, backups, etc. that I had accumulated, uploaded it to my server, and emailed the link to the owner and Tech Senior. I then spent the subsequent 2 weeks in bed, watching Netflix and ignoring phone calls. During the final week, I returned to assist in clearing up various matters, handed over my projects, inquired about the computers and other items I had lent them, promising I would be compensated, and then departed. I was exceedingly fortunate. The following month, the pandemic struck, and a month later, the government mandated the closure of all games, resulting in an almost overnight cessation of their revenue. I believe this was the reason they never compensated me for my equipment, even though I repeatedly asked until I became frustrated. Time went on, and a few weeks ago, I noticed that Tech Senior was searching for a new job. I reached out to him, and we spoke. He informed me that they had endured by hosting private events for companies until they reopened a month ago. All of the other tech employees, except for him, had been terminated, but he had managed to hold on. Eventually, he encountered a dispute with the owner. He did not share many specifics, but the owner requested something either implausible or excessively costly. When Tech Senior proposed a more affordable alternative, the owner erupted and dismissed him on the spot. Tech Senior attempted to reason with him, arguing that he should not be fired until he could train his replacement and find a new position in the meantime, but he was terminated immediately. A week later, I received a call from the owner. He had rehired the younger technicians he had let go during the pandemic and wanted me to come in to answer their questions, primarily concerning the engine I had developed. I agreed, but as we began to arrange the meeting, I suspected he merely intended to have me do it without compensation. When I mentioned my hourly rate, he asserted that we would address that later, then he hung up and never called back. The day of the meeting came, and I remained in my car outside the workshop, anticipating a call inquiring about my whereabouts, which never came. A few days later, I parked adjacent to the warehouse housing all the games, equipped with a Yagi antenna in my car. To my surprise, the Wi-Fi routers I lent them were still present, with the password unchanged. I connected to the Wi-Fi and explored the network. All the PCs I had provided for running the software were still operational, still utilizing the Linux server I had installed, and upon examining the logs, it was clear they were still being used to control the games. I crafted a script that executed on boot, rolled a dice, and then erased the entire drive. I was connected to my Wi-Fi router, making adjustments to my computer and formatting my drives. Then, I drove away. A few days later, I received a call. Apparently, when the Monday shift arrived, the control system for one of the games was unresponsive, and the browser displayed a timeout. They attempted to reset the power for the entire rack housing all the PCs multiple times, hoping it would resolve the issue because, turning it off and on again always works. When they finally stopped trying, they realized that all 8 games were inoperative. The new, old tech staff deduced that the drives had likely failed, but they lacked any knowledge of my system, making it impossible for them to set it up. When I inquired about Tech Senior, the owner offered some excuse about him quitting and not wanting to continue working there. I expressed my willingness to assist. After all, this had once been my dream job. However, I was now employed by a large company, had limited availability, and charged a premium. I could come to set it up, but my hourly rate now stood at $150. He negotiated it down to $100, which still represented about twice what I earned currently. Upon arrival, I inspected the PCs, pulled up the email I had sent him a year earlier, pointed out that the serial numbers matched the labels, and declared my delight in finding my lost equipment. I took the first PC and carried it to my vehicle. We argued, and I informed him that I was either reclaiming all the equipment or he needed to pay me over $2,400. He threatened to call the police, but I possessed the evidence proving this equipment was mine. Eventually, he consented and I got to work. All my software was still on Bitbucket, even with the few modifications Tech Senior had managed to implement, along with all configuration files and scripts outlining the game workflow that Tech Senior had periodically adjusted and saved. Therefore, it was a relatively straightforward job. I restored everything to working order and then stayed for several additional hours, explaining various aspects to the tech team. I generated my invoice and departed, exhausted but satisfied. Yesterday, a nice sum of approximately $3,600 was credited to my bank account. From what I gathered, all 8 games had been out of operation for 3 days. Each game costs between $80 and $120, requires an hour to complete, and necessitates an additional half-hour for preparations, yielding 12 slots each day, generating an average income of $9,600 daily when fully booked. This is, of course, just revenue. The profit after accounting for rent, salaries, electricity, and consumables used in games, among other expenses, is significantly lower, but the exact unknown to me. Prior to the pandemic, roughly 80% of slots were filled during weekdays and 100% over the weekends. I can't help but think that I caused him a loss of approximately $23,000, not including the irate customers who were forced to reschedule, simply because he was unreasonable. Had he compensated me for my property or not terminated his only technician, none of this would have transpired. In summary, my employer was difficult, imposed excessive overtime, and failed to compensate me for equipment I had agreed to sell him. Subsequently, he dismissed all the staff who understood how his business operated. I ultimately decided to reclaim my equipment that he had taken, disrupting his business and incurring significant financial losses.